Bruce DuMont back. Thanks very much for joining us. Last week, of course, in a party line vote, the House Judiciary Committee voted 2 articles of impeachment against the president. The full House will vote this coming week. And in addition to that story, the long-awaited IG report, Michael Horwitz's look into the origins of the investigation into Donald Trump, also came out. And your reaction to that report, was that exactly what you were looking for, or was there too much split news for you as a Republican?
The IG report is a little bit like a Rorschach test, and you get to see a little bit what you want. However, I can tell you that there are certain things that people have claimed that are categorically false. Like former Director Comey saying that he was vindicated. When IG Horwitz said nobody who touched this is anywhere close to vindicated. Comey was even backpedaling this morning on Chris Wallace because he went from saying, oh, I think the idea that FISA abuse happened is ridiculous, to saying, well, you know, there was some sloppiness, right? So he already knows he's in hot water. I'm glad it's out there because it has shown what a circus this has been over the past 3 years of rumor and innuendo driving a political investigation.
Scott Hibbert, how do you see it?
Okay, so first of all, let's go back to the report. The first things is it said the core argument was that the opening of the investigation was lawful and legitimate. There's no deep state conspiracy. All of the hoopla around that is just not true. In terms of like bias, the FBI was absolved of that. And one of the things that came out is one thing that came up is there was actually a lot of anti-Hillary sentiment among the FBI agents that were involved in these investigations as well. So it wasn't a vindication of the way in which the FISA process operated. It wasn't a vindication of many of the mechanics of the process.
But 17 significant inaccuracies or omissions.
Right. But I think what you need to keep in mind is if the reason why they opened this investigation is because Donald Trump has had relationships with members of the Russian mafia going back to the 1990s. They've been laundering money through his casinos and his apartments. And when Fusion GPS first started investigating, this is the opposition research group, they were former Wall Street Journal investigative reporters. When they started investigating it on behalf of a conservative foundation that was concerned about Trump's participation in the Republican primary, they started piecing this all together. And they're like, oh my God, this guy has all kinds of ties to Russia. And then once the DNC hacking starts happening and Russia is behind that, that's when they turned to the FBI and said, hey, you need to look into this. This is out of our league.
So I want to ask our Republicans a question. If a foreign nation is somehow engaged in conversations or relationship building with someone who's running for president of the United States, let's take this current situation.
So like a former MI5 officer.
Let's just put all that in the background. This is a what if. If all that was happening and you or agents of the government or the news media thought that something was smelly, wouldn't you go to the FBI? Wouldn't that be the first place you would go as the #1 law enforcement agency, certainly in this country? That's where you would go to begin an investigation into allegations that something was rotten and stinky out there.
You're asking, I mean, the world doesn't need another wannabe pundit talking about the details of the IG report. But as far as smelliness in D.C. and smelliness of campaign, if you want to report everything that stinks, you'll be reporting till the cows come home.
Right.
Okay. I look at the IG report as more from an organizational behavior problem. I'm not criticizing point by point like Scott can and does. I'm saying the FBI as a culture will protect its own and will massage and nudge things into a template that protects the institution. That's not because they're the FBI. It's because they have this internal bureaucracy whose purpose is to protect itself.
Right.
And they can slap themselves on the wrist and then go do it again. That's fine. I get that.
Yeah.
That's how I look at it.
And I would agree with that.
Jeff?
I would agree with that.
I think the telling thing is that since the FISA court was founded in 1979, it has something like a 99% grant rate of giving out warrants, okay? And the charges against the Trump campaign, or these 4 individuals in the Trump campaign, were so rock solid that the FBI needed to actually tamper with evidence in order to get it to be passed. That tells you all you need to know right there. I mean, and that's IG Horowitz. This is not me saying this. This is IG Horowitz saying it, that an FBI lawyer omitted stuff, exculpatory evidence from the FISA campaign, which speaks to the institutional abuse, which I completely agree with. You cannot have the FBI investigating itself. There need to be serious consequences here. And if the Democrats were not blinded by Donald Trump, they would agree with these systematic abuses that are uncovered.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what everyone is saying as far as it governing itself. I think every organization has its problems with kind of people just getting out of line, I guess, you know, and not really following the ethics and the code of conduct that they're supposed to be following and within. But I will say, you know, everyone likes to bring up the Peter Strzok text and all that stuff. This report, if I'm not mistaken, also uncovered texts that were like pro-Trump, talking about watching people squirm and just being really excited. So when I look at this, I look at it incredibly objectively from the point that the FBI seems to be broken internally to some extent. And I don't agree. I agree with you as far as like it's messed up that they faked the information necessary to get the FISA warrant.
That's not
granted.
messed up. That would be criminal. That should be criminal.
It is criminal. It should be, and it should be taken care of.
Derek, all of the coverage of all of the emails involving Peter Strzok and Lisa Page, and Orr and his wife as well, working at GPS.
No.
All of that, which has been out there for well over a year. I think a lot of conservatives could probably quote every one of those emails.
Yep.
Only in Washington, D.C. can a inspector general look at all those things and say he saw no political bias. Because nobody beyond the Beltway, beyond the Beltway
I think it was
believes
because
that.
he saw it from both sides.
Forget the politics of it. That's why the biggest thing Trump has going for him in the fall of 2020 is the people see that D.C. is not serious about anything other than political vendettas.
Right.
Yes.
We talked about
Or covering their ass.
Covering their ass. We talked about trillion-plus deficits that are now structurally embedded, and we can't get you. You'll put people to sleep if you try to bring that up.
Okay, 2 things. I want to come back to deficits because that's enormously important. But let's keep in mind that the FBI involved itself in a significant way in the 2016 election and changed the outcome of the election. They were very much involved in Hillary's emails, and they announced, and James Comey, 10 days before the election day, announced that they were reopening that investigation.
Because of Anthony
Weiner.
Weiner.
It's your position that Comey swung the election.
Changed the tenor in the last 10 days of the election. Okay. So when people start talking about this deep state conspiracy against Trump, you know, keep in mind there was 2 investigations going on. One was carried out in public, one was carried out in private. Just keep that in perspective.
What I'm talking about gross misconduct, ineptitude on the part of the FBI.
And that's the best possible
The FBI, in my view, has done more disservice than service to this country in the last 25 years. Back shortly. Bruce DuMont back. Thanks very much for joining us. Following up on my comment at the end of the last segment, I want to highly recommend the new film, Richard Jewell. It's the latest from Clint Eastwood. If you've not seen it, I would totally recommend that you go out and see it. And it is the story of Richard Jewell, who was accused erroneously by the FBI, by the news media, of being responsible for the 1996 Olympic bombing in Atlanta. It's a scary movie. It's scary because you see how the Federal Bureau of Investigation, working with local news media, completely frame this guy. They frame him. They destroy his life. And again, when you look at that MO, you see examples. I mean, you see examples of Carter Page, of others that the FBI and the Department of Justice have destroyed. These are names that we know. These are names in the news now. But again, the Richard Jewell story capsulizes in a very dramatic way, and a great storytelling by Clint Eastwood. Go see the movie, because it's about this relationship between a corrupt FBI agent. This is one of the bad apples. You know, we always hear when something like, well, you know, Peter Strzok, it was just a few bad apples. I say BS. It isn't just a few bad apples. It's a few truckloads of bad apples. And again, whether it's the way that they handled the anthrax investigation, how they completely screwed up the 9/11, the information about 9/11 before it happened. I mean, the abuses of power. You talk about abuses of power and abuses of Congress, of J. Edgar Hoover for decades. And then you got him, and then, you know, he's vying now with James Comey as one of the most disgraceful directors of the FBI. And by the way, I'm going to repeat something that we had several years ago. We had a Republican-appointed Deputy United States Attorney and a Democrat. Patrick Cotter is the Democrat that we had on the program. And the focus of that program is, what do you do? What should you do if you get a knock on your door from the FBI? And each of them said, don't open the door.
Right. Don't
and
talk.
Call your lawyers. Because what you will see in this film is that when they went to talk to Richard Jewell, they did not read him his Miranda rights, and then they tried a cockamamie scheme to pretend like they read him his Miranda rights. They didn't do it. And experiences that I'm aware of when FBI has talked to people, they don't read them their Miranda rights all the time. So if you fell in love with the FBI because of J. Edgar Hoover and you loved him in the 60s and 70s because he was a communist fighter, that's one reason. That's one chapter of FBI and what they do and what they do. But again, go see the movie. It's devastating. I recommend it highly. Let's take calls. Brian, go ahead. You're on the air. You're listening to us on YouTube. Go ahead.
Hey, Bruce, great show.
Thank you.
My question is, now that Bloomberg is in the race, what effect does the panel think that will have on the election?
Okay, let's. I'm going to let everybody respond to that, but let me go to a poll. This is of primary voters. This is among Democratic primary voters. We're going to take a look at just one graph right now. Joe Biden is in first place at 30%. This is national. Bernie Sanders slipped back into second place at 20%. Elizabeth Warren, a significant drop at 14%. Pete Buttigieg is at 7%. And although he's been in the race for only 2 weeks, Michael Bloomberg is at 5% in the national polls. Now, let's get everybody's response. We'll start with you, Scott Hibbert. Michael Bloomberg, how serious is he or should he be?
He's serious because he's got money. And, you know, money.
In the media empire.
Well, money and organization. Money buys organization. I really wish he would have endorsed somebody like Amy Klobuchar, because he's basically going to pull support from her base. But I think you know, she's got a ground game in Iowa that Bloomberg doesn't have, and running a lot of ads in Iowa is not going to win you the caucuses.
Is she your favorite?
She's up there. I really like her.
Why do you think she is not taken off?
Because she's a Midwesterner and a centrist, and you know, in the primary process, people love, you know, the more radical and the more left you are in the primary process, you know, the more tension you get, and she's competing for the center lanes with people like Joe Biden, who's got a lot of fundraising capability.
Derek Addis.
Yeah, so I could totally have done without him, as I'm sure most people would feel the same way. Not that 5% though, but positive I see is, so I'm a Sanders supporter, and as a Sanders supporter, obviously we all know that he rails against billionaires and big money, right? So what better way to bring light to that than to literally run against a billionaire in this fashion? I think that one of the positives is he's going to chip away at all the other centrist or entrenched candidates, their voting base. So Biden will start moving down a little bit, because I believe some Biden supporters will go to Bloomberg. Klobuchar, I've never really seen her as a threat. And, so I think that can kind of only help Bernie in the long run. By
A Fox News poll, by the way, these are how people feel about the candidates and their stands on the issue. These are those that think that the candidate that they're for they're basically right on the issue. Joe Biden is at 64%. Pete Buttigieg is at 56%.
This is of Democrats?
Elizabeth Warren at 53%. Bernie Sanders at 49%, and Michael Bloomberg at 47%. This is how candidates feel about the issues that these candidates have taken. And I guess the one thing I keep hearing about Joe Biden is that, and by the way, we have rarely, even though we've looked for them, when we have Democrat guests, none of them are, at least in Chicago, they're not very enthusiastic about Joe Biden. The news media has been trying to write off Joe Biden from day one, but Joe Biden seems to be hanging in there.
He's got staying
It depends. It depends on what poll you look at. And so again, to Jeff's credit, I'd like to see the back end of how this poll was conducted and who was actually polled, because like a Real Clear Politics poll that just came out shows Bernie Sanders handily beating Trump in a general election by 6 points now.
What does Biden do? What does Biden do?
He beats him by like maybe 1 or 2 points.
Would you agree? Since now I'm going to have someone left of center give an opinion of the news media now.
Yeah, I'll definitely.
Would you agree that the national news media has not been very fair to Joe Biden?
No. Well, I think they, for some reason, they continue to show him in like the most positive light, and all of the gaffes and everything that he has, they just kind of like mull over them, and they're making the conversation not so much about Biden still being at the top as much as it's about Pete Buttigieg is moving up, or Warren is doing this week.
Scott, what do you think of the treatment of Joe Biden? Has it been fair by the national media?
Well, and so far he's still a front runner. I mean, I think they've been treating him pretty well. I think the argument's really made that Sanders is not taken as seriously as he should be.
Okay.
Let's
hear from our Republicans.
Can I get back to Bloomberg?
Yeah, sure.
This is a head scratcher for me because he typically doesn't do things in which he's not convinced himself he will prevail, win. Mm-hmm. Ton of money, very smart, experienced, but because he's had to unpack his previous actions and kind of embrace an ideology today, he comes off as more of a technocrat and a manager than an ideologically driven leader. And the fact that he's got his personality is kind of lacking.
I think that it's an interesting play to take a New Yorker with net unfavorables, who is a billionaire, to run him against a New Yorker with net unfavorables, who is a billionaire. So he does bring the media empire to him, right, which is actually kind of playing into Trump's hands about the fake news. So I think he actually takes a lot of Trump's negatives away, or at least neutralizes them, without bringing a lot of positives himself. Now, it's interesting because if you actually look at the technocracy that happened under Bloomberg, he is one of the most ardent fighters against an individual's right to bear arms, and has actually implemented policies restricting that. But stop and frisk is a thing that blew up on the left, and now he has to defend himself. So if you actually look at, an example of a Democrat who is going to be center-left, who's going to be a good technocrat and actually implement solutions, you'd get Bloomberg. But because he's 5 years behind the time in the culture wars, he'll never get out of the primary.
If he was on the ticket, if he was the Democratic nominee, are you worried that he would pull a lot of Republican votes to him in a general election?
No.
Nobody.
I think. Sorry, say that again.
If Bloomberg were the Democratic nominee, would he be attractive to a lot of Republicans?
Yeah, I think so.
Because they would say that he would be an alternative to Donald Trump.
Yeah, I think that.
I would say no. But Bernie Sanders is that person that you're talking about. He is the one who speaks to both sides of the political sphere, because of people's most desired thing right now is they worry about health care.
I think Bloomberg's potential really looking to implement that. keep soft Democrats home. That's the value there.
Kenton, a question. If Donald Trump ran against Bernie Sanders And the campaign became a knockdown, drag-out discussion between capitalism and democratic socialism.
Thank you.
Do you think the Republicans would win that battle at the poll?
At this point, yeah.
Do you?
I think there's an uncomfortable amount of crossover vote of people who voted for Bernie in the primary and Trump in the general last cycle. But given that Trump is now a known thing, I'm confident that the Republicans would win that argument.
I think the UK vote kind of gives the tailwinds to the Republicans.
And we're going to come back and talk about that and Boris Johnson when we continue. I'm Bruce DuMont. Thanks for joining us tonight.
The economy is not working.
Bruce DuMont back in Chicago. Thanks very much for joining us wherever you are from coast to coast. Again, don't forget our GoFundMe campaign. If you have not yet thought of keeping this program alive and well in 2020, it costs money to do it. We need some help to do it. And again, GoFundMe.com. And again, as I said, I think last week, it's always nice to go on there and see, names that you know. That's always nice to see. But it's even more fun to see names that you don't know. People who are listeners, they write little notes about what they like about the show or how long they've been listening to the show, watching the show, and supportive of our effort here to be as fair and balanced as we possibly can in very combustible times. So again, to those people who've taken the time, whether you're writing or donating $25 or $100, doesn't make any difference what the amount is. Again, just going to GoFundMe.com and looking up Beyond the Beltway is something that would be very appreciated. Other big news last week, Boris Johnson.
Yeah.
Conservative Party, biggest landslide victory in decades.
Yeah.
Your reaction to that, Professor?
Well, a couple of things. First off, it really was about Brexit, and the Labour Party was trying to make it about everything else, and all people wanted to talk about was Brexit. And they had a very muddled view, or a muddled position, whereas the Tories had a very clear position, get Brexit done. There was also an enormous amount of disinformation on social media, which was kind of shocking. But at the end of the day, you can't beat something with nothing. And Jeremy Corbyn really offered nothing as an alternative, and Labour got hammered.
Is there a lesson to be learned by Democrats in 2020?
I think there's two lessons. One is don't pull way far left and think you're going to capture the center, because the center is just not there. And it was kind of interesting, particularly in those working class neighborhoods that went Tory. They want big government, they want X, Y, and Z, but at the end of the day, they're not very socialist; they're very nationalist. And so the immigration issue was kind of core to that narrative. But the other thing that I would say is people were tired of Brexit and they wanted to get beyond Brexit, and that was part of the appeal of Johnson, is that the Tories are going to put this behind us. I think one of the lessons that the Republicans ought to be wary of is if there's going to be any fatigue in the 2020 cycle, it's going to be fatigue. It's going to be Trump fatigue, and so they should not read too much into the outcome of this election.
That's a good point, because a disruptor can only disrupt so long.
Yep.
Right. I think one of the things that came out of the UK was that you can ignore nationalism and populism at your own peril. I think it's here to stay. This is why I keep going back to culture. There's pushback. Cultures can and do push back. And this idea that we're going to go back to a centralized bureaucracy to solve these things, when the will of the people, for 3 years now, has been ignored. And they do want to pass them. They don't want to be held accountable to Brussels any longer.
What do you, Derek, tell us why you are for Bernie Sanders?
So, I've said this before. I mean, he just when I listen to him talk, and from what I hear a lot of other people saying, it's like this person actually genuinely cares about my well-being and the well-being of everyone else around him, right? And so when you look at the policies that he wants to enact, I mean, he doesn't speak from a blue, a red, a left, a right. He literally just says, for the people. When you look at his track record, I mean, this individual over the past 40 some odd years, politically and as an activist, has been on the right side of history. And you can't say that for a lot of people who are vying to be the president of the United States, let alone to be, the city alderman or something.
What's his biggest congressional?
And when he honeymooned in the Soviet Union? Is that the right side of history?
What has been his biggest congressional victory in 40 years?
So it was a veterans VA funding bill recently. It was a couple years ago, and if you look at a lot of his track record, a lot of it's bipartisan. So we're talking about the polarization of DC now, right? And that's true. It's gone way left and way right, and there's no middle ground anymore. The time of passing legislation, in the 80s with like bipartisan support and all that stuff, that doesn't happen anymore, right?
But voting to support veterans is not exactly a defining profile in courage.
Well,
especially if you're talking about bipartisan.
I would say it's a testament to his viability as someone who can get things done on both sides of the fence. I mean, he's always been an independent, and he's always been able to converse and enact legislation with both sides of the field.
Are there other examples of that?
So he has, I don't have him off the top of my head right now.
So
one thing I'll say about Bernie Sanders is he does connect with people.
Oh yeah.
And one of the things that came out in the British election is people kind of like Boris Johnson. I mean, many of them see him as cartoonish or buffoonish or whatever, but there's a sense that he gets it, and he's going to be a disruptor. Whereas Jeremy Corbyn was aloof, and I think that the one thing that Sanders really has going for him is that ability to connect, particularly with working people, in a way that's that's going to be helpful.
There are two main takeaways from the recent British elections. The first is Twitter is not real life. And because if you looked at the Twitter sphere, it was like, oh my God, Labor's going to win in a landslide instead of having the worst defeat since Thatcher was originally elected. The second is Jeremy Corbyn was a complete millstone around Labor's neck because of his anti-Semitic comments in the past, for his refusal to condemn the IRA, for his public appearances with the IRA. It was 100% about Corbyn. And it's similar to what the Democrats did in 2016, where they put an unlikable figurehead against somebody who is kind of likable, and who knows, maybe this guy's a bit of a rascal. And
he does lie all the time, but beyond that,
okay. I mean, but again, it's look at the similarities to 2016. There are protests out in the street of London. Not my prime minister. Sorry, man, he kind of is.
And just for what it's worth, at least my Twitter feed was projecting a Tory victory because Labour was just so deeply divided.
I would commend you for not being in the bubble then.
But nobody expected the landslide that came out. But I think part of it is because the Liberal Democrats pulled a lot away from Labour, and the Scottish Nationalist Party pulled away from Labour.
But if you look at the right side, Boris boxed out the Brexit Party, right? And there were no people pulling for his votes from the right, and yet Jeremy Corbyn was far left and still not far enough for the Liberal Democrats, the chair of which who even lost her own seat.
I think Scott was correct when he initially said that this is. The British people got tired of the Brexit being ignored, and they wanted to get past it. And they kind of dismissed everything else.
Yeah. I want to go back to, because you are from Arizona, you flew in to be with us this evening. I want to talk a little bit about Arizona politics, because my first question is, do you believe that in 2020, Arizona is likely to be a significant battleground state in the Electoral College?
Yes. And others do as well. Chuck Todd is spending time there. George Soros is spending a lot of money there. Bloomberg launched his campaign in Arizona. One of the reasons is thankfully, we're rid of both McCain and Flake, which I think is both good for the country and Arizona. Mm-hmm. And you've got a pivotal campaign between McSally and Kelly. If there's one Senate seat that's going to get flipped in 2020, I think it's going to be Arizona.
Okay. And what about you have good things to say about the incumbent Democrat Senator Sinema?
My prediction is Kyrsten Sinema will probably be the first female president of the U.S.
And why do you say that?
She's figured out how to be a politician. She's smart. She's strategically has a long vision of things. She doesn't get pulled into the day-to-day conflicts. She's not strident like she was when she was in the State House. She's built a brand. She knows how to do it. And I disagree with a good bulk of what she believes in, but she's cagey, and Hollywood calls it the Q quotient, how likable you are. She is likable.
A likable,
and she's
likable,
which goes a long way.
Which does go a long way, and it doesn't get you in the weeds about policy differences. You just like her,
especially considering she's taken some more conservative positions than Jeff Flake even would have, which is very interesting to watch.
What's the tough point for Senator Sinema is going to be when she gets a tough vote in front of her, like a Supreme Court justice or an impeachment. And so far, she has stayed miles away from those. She doesn't even mention it.
Are you know, there's been talk about who are the Republicans who are most likely to maybe jump ship and vote for impeachment. Not much has been said of Democrat senators that might go the other way, other than Joe Manchin. Are there? Could she be a vote against conviction in the Senate?
Yes.
Okay. Any other names you want to throw on the pile?
Susan Collins.
Susan
Maine.
Collins, right.
It's gonna be a tough one.
No, I think the
Cory
Kavanaugh.
Gardner
I think the Kavanaugh hearings like threw that out. No,
she made her bed and she's lying in it now.
No, it showed that the Democrats will give no quarter, and there is no longer the Senate that she grew up in where there can be a reasonable middle. And so if she goes out by herself, she's going to be left alone by herself. The Democrats will not come to her rescue. She will not stick her neck out like that.
So only 3 votes? What about Cory Gardner in Colorado? That's the only other name. We all think that Mitt Romney will be 1 vote, okay?
Yes.
Gardner absolutely has a tough race on his hands this cycle. I do not think that...
Murkowski likes being irreverent, and she likes being that outsider. I can see that going.
An impeachment, a vote for impeachment by a Republican gains them nothing electorally, because the Democrats who hated them will hate them as they did before, and the Republicans who would have potentially turned out will abandon them.
Yeah, but it might be the death knell for Susan Collins.
We got to pause. 1-800-723-8289. One more segment. Don't go away. Bruce DuMont back in Chicago. Thanks very much for joining us. The president has said that he would like a long trial. He's not worried about a long trial in the Senate. Mitch McConnell has said he'd like to have a quick trial, get it over with as quickly as possible. The president has even hinted that maybe he wants to testify at the trial in the Senate next year. Your reaction? Should this be... Jeff, as a Republican, you want Donald Trump to win re-election.
Sure.
Is it better for Donald Trump to have an elongated showcase for his position, or should you get it over with as quickly as possible?
So I think what I was saying during the break is that the Democrats are realizing that the Republicans get a turn, right? So the months of hearings between Nadler and Schiff and the circus acts that those have been. There's going to be an ability to present alternative evidence that discredits all of that. Of course, Mitch McConnell is going to go on record saying that he wants it done quickly, because if he said he wanted it done slowly, that would kind of be giving away the game.
What about if he refused to call it? That would be a big mistake?
Constitutionally, he can't, right? Now... How do you resolve that, and do you resolve that before the 2016 or the 2020 election? No, because it would have to involve the Supreme Court, and I don't know how that would actually work out. But constitutionally, he's required to do it in an amount of due haste, I think. So there's no likelihood that he just doesn't do it.
Kenton.
I disagree. I'll tell you why. I study Aikido, and one of the sayings is there's no such thing as revenge, but there's my turn. This idea that gets floated that the Republicans would ever do anything like this, they always say that. So it's not going to happen. The Democrats know it, so there's no use threatening them with it. What I think the upside to this for Trump by extending it is shows how unserious and corrupt D.C. is. This is not speaking to the legal components that Scott likes to cite, which is fine, but this has now transcended legalities. It is a political food fight, and it's only going to get settled at the ballot box, and the more it's pointed out to the people, the more they see it, the more they're either going to ignore it and pull the lever for Trump.
But will they see, in your opinion, if the president decides to testify, first of all, I would predict the ratings will be higher than ever before.
He should not testify.
You don't think he should testify?
Let's not talk legally. Let's talk. You think
Correct.
politically
I'm
he
talking,
shouldn't testify?
I would
think
think
it would
he should.
be brilliant.
I don't know. I think there's there's a
he
lot
has
of
to-
stuff that goes out
Democrats.
the window once you're under oath.
So first things first, it will be short because the longer it goes on, the more
How long is
information.
short? Sorry.
If they could shut it down in one day, they would do it.
So you think it'll
Mitch
be?
McConnell,
said he wanted to
Mitch
shut it down.
McConnell will railroad it. He'll get it. He will minimize debate.
He'll guide it.
He does
we're
not
talking like,
want.
let's
He
say
does
a
not
week.
want anything coming out. He doesn't want anything discussed. And to that end, there will be no testimony. Not because it wouldn't be smart politically, but there are very real legal issues. And if Trump gets up there and starts talking, he's going to perjure himself. And that's why he had many times.
That's what happened to Clinton.
He had many opportunities to speak to the Mueller inquiry. He had any number of people. Those people were subpoenaed
here's where I think that
to participate.
that fails. You talk about the legal issues, but the legal institution that we've relied upon to guide us in the last 10, 15 years is as corrupt as you suggested.
Which institution were you talking about?
I'm talking about the FBI. The FBI is yet another institution that has failed its citizenry, and people no longer have trust and faith in it to execute its powers appropriately.
And yet, when you bring that subject up, because the FBI used to be a favorite of Republicans, when Republicans in the last couple of years have brought those deficiencies up, the Democrats, who usually have been opposed to a lot of their practices,
I agree.
certainly the activities.
We had the church. You remember the church
committee? Absolutely.
It is actually kind of ironic
now
that
the church commission. If you couldn't do that today because the same people that vilified the CIA in the late 70s, are now the first ones to self-halo any CIA analyst who agrees with them politically.
Yes.
So there is an irony that it took Donald Trump to get liberal Democrats to defend the FBI. I mean, no, that's not lost
true.
on me. So.
But again, the question is, I don't think they would. I don't think they would necessarily want to do that during a political campaign. I mean, if part of the debate of Joe Biden and his support in the black community, do you think African American Democrats want to be going out there defending J. Edgar Hoover and his assault against Dr. Martin Luther King?
Yeah.
Do you want that to be part of a Democratic primary season? I would say, this is bring it on. Let's let it all hang out there. But you're not going to have Democrats that are going to want to do that.
So one of the underappreciated things here is that the Senate needs to actually be present while testimony and evidence is given, which includes 3 of the Democrat frontrunners. Why would Mitch McConnell not want to pull them off the campaign trail?
Yes, he would.
Right? I mean, that's why the whole idea that this will be short and to the point doesn't really make a ton of political sense.
Can you have a trial in the Senate without bringing up Hunter Biden or calling him to testify?
Absolutely not.
You say absolutely not?
You can't have a legitimate trial. You cannot have it without Hunter.
And this is what I mean about the Republicans get a turn, because
What do you think,
now we get
guys?
to see the other side.
It doesn't matter because there's no there, and if they really want to pull this out, there's a lot to incriminate. Rudy Giuliani, Donald Trump, that whole campaign.
Okay. On that moment of disagreement, I want to thank our guest, Scott Hibbert. Thank you very much. And Derek Addis, thank you very much for being with us this evening. On the Republican side, we've had Kenton McCarthy and we've had Jeffrey Hom. Thank you all for being with us. Hector Pacheco has been helping us this week. Did I get it right? Pacheco. Okay, thank you very much. And Fritz Goldman, nice easy name. Fritz Goldman, remember, thank you all. I'm Bruce DuMont. Until next week, this is Bruce DuMont, as I just said. Good night from Chicago.